this Oklahoma program's been 10-2 at worst, 11-1 most seasons since 2015, transitioning to the SEC. I think the real grind is not necessarily looking at, losing by 5 touchdowns to LSU and getting hammered by Alabama before making kind of a look good comeback in the second half, but that grind against the mid-level where Oklahoma's probably better in a one-game scenario, but when you play Arkansas, Auburn, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, etc., week after week after week after week, then you're going to get picked off, once every 4 to 5 games, that kind of deal. But when you said 7 or 8 wins, that I got to say that took me back a bit, because most people are in that 1 to 2 game projection of a downgrade in win totals per season.
Yeah, I'll say this much. It probably is 7 to 8 is probably a little pessimistic. 8 to 9 is probably more realistic, but I think there definitely would have been years. I look at 2020, for example, where things could have spiraled out of control for the Sooners in a hurry in the SEC, because if they'd started 1-2 in the SEC that season, as they did in Big 12 play, man, I'm not sure they ever would have recovered. I'm not sure whether the culture in that locker room was conducive to that type of bounce back. And so I think there actually would have been a lot of fluctuation. I can think of years, specifically you look at that 2017 team that was as good as anybody in the country. Sure. I look at 2018 as Lincoln Riley's first team, because that was the first time where he got to go through a recruiting cycle, really instill his vision and earn the respect of his players as their head coach as opposed to their play caller. And so I think that 2018 team probably would have won 10 or 11 games in the SEC. 2019, that's probably a 9 or 10 win team. Like I said, 2020, man, like it could have absolutely snowballed off the grid if the Sooners had opened the way that they did and they had to play an SEC schedule as opposed to the Big 12 schedule. I know 2020 was weird, man, but I don't know if they would have won more than 3 or 4 games that year, assuming they got off to the start that they did, and they had to face an SEC schedule as opposed to a Big 12 schedule. So as I look at this last year in 2021, it's just such a wild card, man. Like 2021 was such a weird season, such a bizarre season in so many facets. And so I think as you prepare for SEC play, which I believe will start in 2023, I think that's when Oklahoma and Texas are going to make the move. I think this program is going to be in far better shape under Brent Venables to compete in that conference than they would have been under Lincoln Riley. And I would project that they'll pretty immediately be a double-digit win team and will be contending for conference championships in the SEC sooner rather than later, I would imagine.
Parker, since you answered my next question, I'll ask this. The new Big 12 minus Oklahoma and Texas plus BYU, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati. So I think the Big 12 did just about as well as they could possibly have in trying to mend its conference, and they did it with quantity over quality to a certain extent, but even the quality was, again, about as good as they could do. How do you view the Big 12 going forward as a Power 5 conference without the 2 big guns? That you lose 20% of your league in terms of membership, but probably, what's your estimation in terms of resources and recruiting and everything, brand image? You're probably losing half the league, if not more.
Yeah, that's the hard part, is that Oklahoma and Texas, in terms of revenue and in terms of public interest, they drive it for the Big 12. They are the biggest driver. And I want to say you lose about 75% of your viewership and revenue when Oklahoma and Texas walk out the door. So I know everybody is going to try to sell the new Big 12, particularly, you're bringing in Cincinnati, you're bringing in UCF, you're bringing in Houston and BYU. All those are teams that have won double-digit games in the very recent past. In fact, all of those teams, save for UCF, I believe, won double-digit games in 2021. So those aren't pushover teams by any stretch of the imagination. I just don't know whether anybody's going to take the new Big 12 seriously as a Power 5 conference, because the new SEC is going to be a titan of its own. And if Lincoln Riley continues to take USC on an upward trajectory, Dan Lanning does the same at Oregon, you're talking about the Pac-12 bouncing back into national relevance. The ACC, that's going to be on the upswing once again as well, with Mario Cristobal at Miami and obviously Dabo Swinney at Clemson. I find it hard to believe that Florida State is going to stay down, although I think they'll need a new coaching staff in order to get back to where they once were. So the Pac-12, the ACC, and the SEC, those are all conferences that I think are going to be playing top to bottom very good football within 2 to 3 years. And then obviously, you know what you're getting every year in the Big Ten, right? It's Ohio State's league, but you'll have Michigan, Michigan State, occasionally a team like Northwestern or Iowa, Wisconsin. All those teams will be in contention in the top 25, competing for New Year's Six bowls. So I think the Big 12 is going to be hard pressed to stay on par with the rest of the Power Five in that capacity. I'm not saying it can't be done, and that's certainly not a diss at a couple programs that are headed in absolutely the right direction right now in Oklahoma State and Baylor. But I struggle to believe that, at least in an immediate sense, those programs are going to be able to go toe-to-toe on the big stage with the heavy hitters in the SEC and the Big Ten and the ACC. And for that reason, just because I think if you got to a playoff situation and you had Baylor matched up with the likes of Alabama or Clemson or even Oregon, I don't think those are games that the Big 12 is going to be able to win. And so I think in the long term, the Big 12 has the opportunity to get there. But I think in the short term, a lot of folks nationally are just going to regard the new Big 12 as another group of five conference almost.
Yeah, I think your big stage part of that comment is what makes total sense and is what is going to be the difference right there, because I went back and looked at the 5-year to 10-year track records for those four schools, the four additions to the Big 12 against the Power Five, and they represent themselves rather well. But the bulk of those wins are against, your 500 clubs across the Power Five. So they're going to be able to go out and schedule Big Ten and ACC teams that are 6th, 7th place teams in the conference and win a fair share of those games. But that's not going to help the Big 12. It's going to make it a very competitive league from top to bottom, aside from Kansas, unless they get their act together. You got to think that, man, it's going to be a wild card as to who's going to emerge out of this league every year. It's going to be extremely fun and competitive. But in terms of trying to get somebody up to that upper echelon to take on a Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama in a playoff situation, looks to be a very tall task.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue that the Pac-12 has run into in recent years, right? It cannibalizes itself. The Pac-12 isn't a bad football conference. It's just the fact that there are so many teams that are competitive with one another on a week-to-week basis that, like you said, they can't ever get a team to that upper echelon. The last team that they sent to the college football playoff was Washington in 2016. And that again, that's a conference that you'll watch those teams go into bowl season, and generally they have success, right? Utah gave Ohio State all they could handle and probably should have won that game in the Rose Bowl, just to pick one example. And so, again, it's not to say that the new Big 12 is going to be a bad football conference. I'm just saying I don't think that there will be a team in the new Big 12 that can ascend to that top tier in college football, at least in the short term.